Usernames, I like that.
Kingdom Protista, chapters 11, sections 1 and 2 only. Very small amount of stuff in the book for a large kingdom. So what is a protist exactly? Well, there's some pictures here that show you, but you may need to see. There are simple organisms whose cells are eukaryotic. What does that mean?
It means an organism that has a nucleus.
Yes, that's what it means, or it has any other membrane-bound internal structures. They're almost always single-celled. You have some that are multicellular and some that are actually colonial. And what that means is if you see this picture down here, all these individual small little cells are individual cells of Volvox, and they like to organize themselves together into these funny spheres that they then run around in. So it's basically a single-celled organism that prefers to live in a group. The other thing that's important about protists is that their cells never organize into complex tissues. They're always very, very simple in their organization. How do protists get the nutrients they need? Well, they can be autotrophic, which means...
It means that they make their own food.
That's exactly what it means. So they use photosynthesis, most of them. They can be heterotrophic, which means they can't make their own food and they have to eat stuff. And they can be a combination of both autotrophic and heterotrophic. There are actually 3 different types of heterotrophic eaters. They are phagocytes, which eat by engulfing things, and some of you might remember endocytosis that we did last semester. And hold on a second. Sorry. All right. It's basically when you have a blob-like cell that comes up and engulfs a particle. And I'm going to speed this along a little bit because you don't have to know exactly how the membrane interacts. But eventually what happens is the membrane surrounds the particle and brings it in as a vacuole. And then that little, what they call a phagosome, and that little bit will then react with lysosomes, which release digestive enzymes and allow that to work. Okay? Sounds good? Moving right along. You can also have decomposer saprophytes that break down dead stuff, basically. And I can show you a piece of this video really quickly, but it's going to be a bacteria breaking down the cheek cell. And I'm going to just fast forward through it really, really fast because this is mostly in Spanish and it's a class that's doing some experiments with cheek cells. So here are some cheek cells that they took from you can see it a little better there, from a mouth of a student. And here, all these little dots in here are all bacteria that are starting to digest that cheek cell, because the cheek cells are very much like other skin cells. They're on this sort of outside part of the body, technically, even though it's inside your mouth. So you slough off those cells periodically. You're always growing new ones. And so these are the ones that were close to being, kind of falling off the inside of your cheek. And they therefore are really close to being dead and being able to get digested. And that's what you're seeing happen here with these bacteria. And eventually the whole cell sort of starts to break down and it's gone. Okay? All right. And these are bacteria types right here left behind. All right. Go back. You can also be parasites, which absorb nutrients from a host. And most of you have a pretty good idea of what a parasite is. Again, the third main type of how protists get the nutrients they need is they can be both autotrophic and heterotrophic at the same time. There's a whole group of protists that can do this. They're kind of cool. We'll talk about those more later. Just to give some distinguishing features about what a symbiote is. A symbiote is an organism that lives closely in or on another organism, and it takes its nutrients from it. And there are actually 3 different kinds of symbiotes, or symbiotic relationships, I should say. If you have a relationship where both the organisms are benefiting from the arrangement, it is called mutualism. If you have a situation where the symbiote is benefiting and the host could care less, doesn't matter either way, it's called commensalism. If you have a situation where the symbiote is benefiting but the host is being harmed, then that is called parasitism. By definition, of course, a host is an organism in or on which a symbiote parasite lives to obtain its nutrients. Hopefully that makes sense, and you can distinguish between a symbiote and a host in this way. All right. Protist reproduction. Protists reproduce asexually, where you basically have an individual that clones itself. They just sort of split in half. Oftentimes it's called binary fission, or sometimes even multiple fission. And then you can also have sexual reproduction. And sexual reproduction occurs when you have two organisms that exchange genetic information, and that allows there to be an increase in variability in the population. For instance, and this is not sexual reproduction like you might think, these two are paramecia, and you notice that the paramecium have two nuclei. They have a really big one called a macronucleus and a little one called a micronucleus. What happens with paramecia when they sexually reproduce is the micronucleus divides through meiosis, and half of the genetic information is swapped out with the other individual that is having sexual reproduction with. And then those two nuclei fuse together. And so what ends up happening is that the two individuals that started the sexual reproduction are now genetically different at the end. So it's not like two individuals having lots of babies. It's two individuals actually genetically changing themselves, which is kind of weird. But you get the idea. There is a picture here that shows a little bit of video of both asexual and sexual reproduction. I'm going to kind of skip ahead here. All right, right here, this guy is doing asexual reproduction. Okay, it's just dividing. And if you look a little closer, let me see if I can get a good one. Okay, this individual up here is a regular sized paramecium. And what happens when they divide is they become smaller because you can't magically create more matter. So this guy is about the size where it could divide, and this one's dividing. And now they're going to make these two tiny little paramecium that it'll continue growing again until it's big enough to divide. But also in this video are, hold on, let me make this bigger, are some sexually reproducing paramecia, if I can find them. Let's see here. Oops, I think I've gone too far. Let me go back over here. There. These are two paramecium that are sexually reproducing. You can see a conjugation tube has been created here for them to exchange genetic information, and then eventually they'll just split apart again. But they also, if you watch this all the way to the end, these two individuals eventually kind of pop off. Let me see if I can see it in here. They're almost there. Oh, so close, so close. And right there. Hold on. There. These two are now separate individuals. Okay. There are also sometimes some complicated life cycles that involve both asexual and sexual reproduction within the same species. Most of them have to do with parasites. Malaria, this is just an example of malaria, that depending on which part of its life cycle it's in, whether it's in the human or in the mosquito or whatever host it's in, it either reproduces asexually or sexually. Okay, and so in here we've got, looks like, reproduction probably asexually. In here, at some point, it becomes sexual reproduction, and then it progresses on. So these really, you won't have to ever know one of the, well, at least not in this class, one of these life cycles, but just recognize that they occur, really, really complex life cycles where both asexual and sexual reproduction happen. Okay, how are protists classified? They're grouped according to differences in how they get food and how and whether or not they can move. Okay? There are three main groups, and they are as follows. The protist producers, so those are the ones that make their own food. The protist heterotrophs that can move. I could also say protist autotrophs here instead of producers. The protist heterotrophs that can move, and the protist heterotrophs that cannot move. This right here is an example of a coccolithophore, which is a little protist that in very, very large marine deposits basically make the white cliffs of Dover or other white cliffs in the area of Europe. They're kind of fun in that way. Anyway, those are our groups that we are now going to explore a little more fully, but I think I'm going to stop this recording at this point and do this in parts, so each recording it doesn't have to be so long. So that basically covers Chapter 11, Section 1.